The courtroom was silent, so silent you could hear the rustle of papers and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. All eyes were fixed on the young black girl standing at the plaintiff's table, her posture unwavering, her expression calm. Just moments ago, she had been the target of ridicule. Now, she was commanding the room with nothing more than the sheer force of her words. Judge Thomas Harrington, a man infamous for his sharp tongue and impatience, had spent the last 20 minutes berating her. His condescending tone cut through the air like a knife. "You think you can fool this court?" he sneered, his laughter echoing across the chamber. "A child playing dress-up as an attorney? This is a courtroom, young lady, not a school play." The lawyers seated around the room smirked. Spectators whispered among themselves. The judge's words weren't just meant to humiliate, he wanted to put her in her place. But then, Elena Hayes finally spoke. Her voice was clear, steady, composed beyond her years. She didn't raise her tone or falter under the judge's scrutiny. Instead, she began methodically dismantling the prosecution's case, one precise argument at a time. Her knowledge of legal precedents was razor-sharp. Every claim she made was backed by solid case law, every rebuttal delivered with the confidence of someone who had studied law not for years, but for a lifetime. Gasps rippled through the audience. The smirks faded. The seasoned attorneys in the room sat up straighter, their expressions shifting from amusement to unease. This was no ordinary teenager. The judge's smug expression faltered. He shifted in his chair, glancing at the documents in front of him as if searching for an escape. "I object." One of the prosecutors shot up, his face red with frustration. "Your Honor, I have reason to believe that this individual is not who she claims to be." A murmur spread across the room. Some nodded in agreement. Others leaned in closer, sensing something big was about to happen. Elena turned toward the prosecutor, her piercing gaze unshaken. A faint, knowing smile played on her lips. "Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering, "I can provide my credentials if necessary. But I assure you, every word I've spoken is legally sound. Shall we continue?" The judge's face darkened, his skin turning a deep shade of crimson. His authority, his years of experience, were crumbling under the weight of this teenage girl's intellect. His voice cracked slightly as he demanded, "Who are you?" Elena didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a pristine document, carefully unfolding it before handing it to the bailiff. The paper was passed up to Judge Harrington. As he read, his hands trembled. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. A hush fell over the courtroom. The tension was thick, the anticipation unbearable. And in that moment, everything changed. To understand how Elena Hayes, a 17-year-old girl, ended up standing before a superior court judge, dismantling a legal case like a seasoned attorney, we need to go back to where it all began. Elena grew up in Ridgewood, North Carolina, a quiet suburban town. She was raised by her grandmother, Margaret Sinclair, a retired schoolteacher who had always emphasized the importance of humility, discipline, and standing up for what's right. Elena wasn't like other kids. By age 7, she was reading law books for fun. By 12, she was debating college students and winning. But she never sought attention for her intellect. She preferred to keep a low profile, uninterested in the spotlight. That all changed the day she overheard a conversation at Maplewood Heights, the local apartment complex. A single mother, Danielle Foster, stood in the corner store, her eyes filled with tears as she spoke to the cashier. "I have nowhere to go," she sobbed. "I've paid my rent on time, every single month. But he says I violated my lease. I didn't. I swear I didn't." Elena paused, listening intently. Danielle was talking about Vincent Holloway, her landlord. He was notorious for evicting tenants under false pretenses, clearing out apartments so he could jack up the rent for new occupants. But most people didn't fight back, because they didn't have the resources to do so. Elena approached Danielle after the conversation, her mind racing. "Do you have copies of your lease and rent payments?" she asked. Danielle hesitated before nodding. "I keep everything in a folder at home." That was all Elena needed to hear. "Let me help you," she said, her voice firm. "I think you have a case." Danielle looked at her in disbelief. "But, you're just a kid." Elena smiled. "I've been told that before. Trust me." Over the next few days, she pored over Danielle's documents. And the more she read, the clearer it became. The eviction notice was full of inconsistencies. She didn't hesitate. She drafted a formal legal letter to Holloway, demanding that he halt the eviction or face legal consequences. When he ignored her, she filed a case in small claims court on Danielle's behalf. And just like that, word spread through the neighborhood. The quiet teenager, the girl always buried in books, was taking on a corrupt landlord. Reporters caught wind of the case. The headlines were everywhere. But not everyone was impressed. Many questioned her qualifications. Others mocked the idea of a teenager handling such a serious legal matter. As the court date approached, Danielle grew anxious. "What if we lose?" she asked. "I can't afford a lawyer." Elena reassured her. But deep down, she knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about Danielle anymore. This was about standing up to injustice. This was about proving that age, race, and background do not define a person's capability. And on the morning of the hearing, when Elena walked into that packed courtroom, she was ready. Elena Hayes sat in the cold, dimly lit interrogation room, her hands clasped together on the metal table. The walls around her were bare, giving the space an ominous feel. The only sound was the low hum of the overhead fluorescent light. Across from her, the officer leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying her carefully. "Miss Hayes," he said slowly, tapping his fingers against the table, "the accusations against you are serious. If you fabricated evidence, you could be facing criminal charges." Elena met his gaze without hesitation. "I understand the gravity of this situation, officer," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "But I can assure you, the evidence I presented is legitimate. I have a certified digital forensics report verifying its authenticity." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Then why would Mr. Holloway make this accusation?" Elena didn't flinch. "Because his case is crumbling, and he knows it. This is nothing more than an intimidation tactic." Just then, the door opened, and in walked Mr. Harris, her legal counsel. The retired attorney had been in the game long enough to recognize a baseless accusation when he saw one. With sharp eyes and a confident stride, he took the seat next to Elena. "Officer," Harris said, folding his hands in front of him, "before you say another word, let me make something very clear. My client will not answer any more questions without reviewing the full extent of these allegations. Now, do you actually have evidence, or is this just hearsay from Mr. Holloway? The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Well, at this time, the accusation is under review, but... Then we're done here, Harris interrupted. Unless you have probable cause, you have no right to detain or further question Miss Hayes. The officer sighed and rubbed his temple. She's free to go, he admitted reluctantly. But we will be looking into this matter further. Elena stood, adjusting her blazer. I encourage you to, she said, her tone unwavering. And when you find nothing, I expect this attempt at character assassination to be addressed accordingly. Without waiting for a response, she and Harris exited the room. Outside the station, Danielle Foster was pacing anxiously. The moment she saw Elena step out, she rushed over. Oh my God, Elena, are you okay? What did they say? Elena nodded. They had nothing. Just Holloway throwing out baseless accusations, hoping to rattle us. Danielle exhaled sharply. That man is relentless. What if he tries something else? Elena placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He will. But we'll be ready. As they drove back to Ridgewood, Elena's mind was racing. Holloway wouldn't stop until he had exhausted every dirty trick in the book. He wasn't just trying to evict Danielle anymore, he was trying to break Elena. And she wouldn't let him. The next morning, Elena arrived at Ridgewood Superior Court early, determined to stay ahead of whatever move Holloway's team had planned. As she entered the courtroom, she spotted David Whitaker, Holloway's attorney, whispering furiously with his client. Holloway's face was tight with frustration, his eyes darting toward Elena with barely concealed contempt. All rise, the bailiff announced. Judge Thomas Harrington entered, his expression unreadable. As soon as he took his seat, he wasted no time addressing the elephant in the room. Before we proceed, I have been informed of allegations against the plaintiff's counsel, Miss Hayes. Mr. Holloway, your attorney has claimed that the evidence she presented was falsified. Do you have actual proof to support this claim? Whitaker cleared his throat. Your Honor, given the complexity of digital forensics, it will take time to verify whether. That's not an answer, Mr. Whitaker, the judge interrupted, his voice cold. Do you have evidence, or not? Silence. Elena didn't wait. She rose from her seat, walking confidently to the front. Your Honor, if I may. The judge nodded, allowing her to proceed. Yesterday, I was detained and questioned based on this baseless accusation. And yet, no evidence was presented, because none exists. This is nothing more than a desperate delay tactic. She turned to the opposing counsel. And if the defense wishes to challenge the integrity of my evidence, they are welcome to bring in their own digital forensics expert. But until then, this attempt at defamation is a waste of the court's time. The judge leaned back in his chair, unimpressed with the defense's antics. I agree. This court will not entertain baseless accusations without proof. Mr. Whitaker, I suggest you focus on your actual defense. The landlord's attorney swallowed hard. Yes, Your Honor. Elena returned to her seat, but not before catching the glare from Holloway. He had lost this round, and he knew it. But something told her, he wasn't finished yet. That evening, Elena was in her small office at Hayes Legal Advocacy, preparing for the next day's hearing. She was reviewing case notes when her phone buzzed. It was Jordan Wells, her tech-savvy friend. "Elena, you need to see this." A moment later, a link popped up on her screen. It was a news article, with her name splashed across the headline. Teenage lawyer or fraud? Ridgewood's young prodigy under fire for alleged misconduct. Her stomach clenched as she skimmed through the article. The piece was riddled with misinformation, quoting anonymous sources who claimed she had falsified evidence and was exploiting low-income tenants for personal gain. It was a smear campaign. And there was only one person who could be behind it. Vincent Holloway. Her phone rang again. This time, it was Samuel Reed, the journalist who had covered her case positively in the past. "Elena, I need to talk to you. Holloway's team is feeding the press lies about you. You need to get ahead of this." Elena closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. She had expected Holloway to play dirty. But this? This was war. The next morning, Elena met with Jordan and Samuel at her office. "We need to flip the script," Samuel said. "If Holloway is controlling the media narrative, we have to counter it with hard evidence." Jordan pulled out his laptop. "I did some digging. That article. It's being funded through a PR firm with direct ties to Holloway's real estate empire. He's paying to ruin your credibility." Elena clenched her jaw. "Then we expose him." With Samuel's connections and Jordan's skills, they pieced together a timeline of Holloway's dirty tactics, from fabricated financial records to paid witnesses and now, false media attacks. That night, Samuel published an exposé. The Real Fraud. How Vincent Holloway manipulates the legal system to silence his victims. It spread like wildfire. By the next morning, Ridgewood Tribune, local news stations, and even national outlets were picking up the story. Public outrage swelled. And just like that, the hunter became the hunted. As Elena Hayes walked into the packed courtroom, a renewed fire burned in her eyes. She carried a folder with all the evidence she and Aaron had gathered the night before, proof that Harmony Solutions was nothing more than a shell company controlled by Vincent Holloway. This wasn't just a desperate attempt to frame Danielle Foster. This was fraud. Judge Thomas Harrington called the court to order, his gaze shifting between the attorneys on both sides. "Miss Brooks," he said, addressing Elena, "you were given time to review the financial records presented by the defense. Are you prepared to respond?" Elena stood confidently. "Yes, Your Honor. But before I begin, I would like to submit new evidence of my own." She walked to the bench, handing over a thick file to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "What you have before you, Your Honor, is proof that these financial records are fraudulent. They were created by a shell company, Harmony Solutions, which is directly connected to the defendant, Vincent Holloway." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Holloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer, David Whitaker, visibly paling. The judge flipped through the documents, his expression hardening. "Explain," he said. Elena nodded. "Harmony Solutions is not a legitimate business. It has no real operations, no employees, and no transactions outside of those used to manufacture these so-called financial records. My team traced the payments, and they were created using template software, meaning, Mr. Holloway fabricated them to frame my client, Miss Foster." Gasps filled the room. Holloway shot to his feet. "Lies," he barked. "This is a setup. She's twisting things around." Judge Harrington slammed his gavel. "Mr. Holloway, you will sit down or be removed from this courtroom." Holloway's face burned red as he sank back into his chair, gripping the table. Elena turned back to the judge. "Additionally, Your Honor, we have proof that Mr. Holloway funneled money through this shell company to manufacture fake evidence against Miss Foster. This is a direct attempt to commit fraud upon this court." The judge's glare shifted to Holloway's attorney. "Mr. Whitaker, do you have a response to these allegations?" Whitaker stammered. "Your Honor, these are serious claims, but I need time to review this material." Elena didn't let up. "That won't be necessary. Because, Your Honor, the evidence also shows that Mr. Whitaker's firm received a retainer payment from Harmony Solutions just 2 weeks ago. Which means, at best, Mr. Whitaker failed to do his due diligence, or at worst, he was fully aware of the fraud taking place." The courtroom exploded. Whitaker turned pale. That's absurd." Elena turned to the judge. "We are requesting that this case be dismissed immediately on the grounds of fraud and perjury. Furthermore, we believe that criminal charges should be pursued against Mr. Holloway." Judge Harrington sat back, deep in thought. After a long silence, he turned to Whitaker. "I strongly suggest you confer with your client, Mr. Whitaker." Whitaker and Holloway huddled together, whispering fiercely. It was clear that Holloway was furious, but his lawyer was now visibly sweating. After a tense minute, Whitaker rose, his posture defeated. "Your Honor," he said through clenched teeth, "the defense would like to withdraw our evidence and reconsider our position in this case." Elena smiled. They weren't reconsidering, they were backed into a corner. Judge Harrington nodded. "Very well. Given the new information, I am prepared to make my ruling." The entire courtroom fell silent. "This court finds that the eviction claim against Miss Foster was made in bad faith, supported by fraudulent evidence. The case is dismissed with prejudice, meaning the plaintiff may not file another case on this matter. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into possible fraud and perjury charges against Mr. Holloway." Danielle let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. It was over. Holloway leapt to his feet. "You can't do this. I have rights." Judge Harrington's glare could have frozen fire. "You're lucky I'm not holding you in contempt right now. One more outburst, and I will." Holloway, his hands balled into fists, sat back down. But he knew he had lost. The judge slammed his gavel. "Court is adjourned." As soon as the judge left, reporters swarmed Elena and Danielle. "Elena Hayes. How does it feel to win your first major case?" "Danielle, what does this victory mean for you and your children?" Elena turned to Danielle and nodded. This was her moment. Danielle took a deep breath, stepping forward. "It means that people like me, single mothers, working-class families, we have a chance. Landlords like Vincent Holloway think they can push us around, but today proves they can't." The crowd cheered. A voice called out from behind them. "Elena." She turned to see Aaron, grinning ear to ear. "You did it." Elena laughed, shaking her head. "We did it. I couldn't have exposed that fraud without your help." Aaron shrugged. "Hey, anything to take down a scam artist. Danielle turned to Elena, her eyes welling with tears. I don't even know how to thank you. You saved my family. Elena squeezed her hand. Just promise me one thing, pay it forward. Help someone else when they need it. Danielle nodded. I will. By the next morning, Holloway's world was crumbling. The Ridgewood Tribune ran the headline, Corrupt Landlord Exposed, How One Teenager Brought Down a Fraudster. The district attorney's office announced an official investigation into Holloway's fraudulent practices. Meanwhile, Judge Harrington had filed a formal ethics complaint against Whitaker. And by the end of the week, Holloway was arrested for perjury and fraud. Elena sat in her office, scrolling through the news articles. She had done it. But she knew this was just the beginning. Because if there was one Vincent Holloway, there were dozens more, and she was coming for all of them. Elena closed her laptop, exhaling slowly. The victory felt satisfying, but it wasn't the kind that allowed for rest. If anything, it only solidified what she had known all along: the system was broken, and someone had to keep fighting to fix it. The phone on her desk buzzed. It was a message from Danielle Foster. We won. Because of you. Thank you, Elena. Truly. A small smile touched Elena's lips. It wasn't just about bringing down corrupt figures like Holloway, it was about people like Danielle, people who had been silenced, ignored, and forced into impossible situations by those with power. This was why she did it. This was why she couldn't stop. The case had set off a chain reaction. Other tenants who had been bullied and cheated by Holloway were now stepping forward. A class action lawsuit was forming, and city officials were finally discussing policy changes that would protect renters from predatory landlords. The press wasn't letting go either. Elena's name was making waves in legal circles, and soon enough, she was getting calls from advocacy groups and attorneys who wanted to collaborate. One even suggested she consider law school, officially. But Elena wasn't interested in taking the traditional path. She had already proven she didn't need a degree to bring down fraudsters. She just needed the truth. Later that evening, as she walked through the quiet streets of Ridgewood, she thought about the next steps. She had taken down one corrupt landlord. But there were more. She had exposed one fraudulent scheme. But there would be others. She wasn't naive. The system wasn't built for people like Danielle, it was built to protect people like Holloway. But she had found the cracks. And she knew now, if you pushed hard enough, if you refused to back down, you could break through. Elena stopped at a familiar brownstone apartment and looked up at the dimly lit window. Danielle and her kids were safe. Not because of luck. Not because someone with power had finally decided to help. But because they had fought. And they had won. With a determined breath, she turned and walked away, her mind already racing with new ideas, new battles to fight, new ways to hold the powerful accountable. Because this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The lesson from Elena's story: the power of standing up for justice. Elena's journey wasn't just about exposing a corrupt landlord, it was about challenging a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Her story reminds us that injustice thrives in silence, and those who abuse their power count on people being too afraid, too tired, or too overwhelmed to fight back. But what happens when someone refuses to stay silent? What happens when one person decides to take a stand? That's what Elena did. She wasn't the most powerful person in the room. She wasn't a lawyer with decades of experience. She wasn't a politician with connections. She was just a young woman who saw injustice and refused to look the other way. And that made all the difference. How many times have we seen situations where people in power bend the rules, manipulate the system, or outright break the law just because they believe they can get away with it? Whether it's corrupt landlords, dishonest employers, or even biased institutions, these individuals thrive on the belief that no one will challenge them. But when someone like Elena does challenge them, when someone gathers the facts, exposes the lies, and forces accountability, everything changes. The lesson here is simple but powerful. Courage and knowledge are the most dangerous weapons against corruption. Elena didn't win because she was the loudest or the most aggressive. She won because she was smart, relentless, and unshakable in her belief that the truth matters. She knew that laws exist to protect people like Danielle Foster, but they only work when someone is willing to fight for them. That's exactly what she did. And in doing so, she didn't just win a case. She set off a chain reaction. By exposing Vincent Holloway's fraudulent practices, Elena gave other victims the courage to come forward. She turned one woman's eviction case into a much bigger fight, one that led to a full-scale investigation, criminal charges, and real consequences for those who thought they were untouchable. And that's why this story matters. Because for every Vincent Holloway that gets caught, there are dozens more who continue to manipulate, exploit, and abuse people who don't have the resources to fight back. But when people like Elena stand up, speak out, and refuse to back down, it sends a message: you are not invincible. The truth will always catch up with you. The reality is, stories like this aren't just happening in the courtroom, they're happening everywhere. People face injustice every single day, whether it's in their workplace, in housing, in legal battles, or in the way they're treated by institutions. And too often, they feel like there's nothing they can do about it. But Elena's story shows us that one person can make a difference. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to be powerful. All you need is the courage to take that first step, to speak up, to ask questions, to refuse to be intimidated. When enough people do that, change is inevitable. So here's the real question: what would you do in Elena's place? Would you have the courage to keep going, even when the odds were stacked against you? Would you fight for someone else's rights, even if it meant standing up to people who tried to silence you? Because if there's one thing this story proves, it's that justice doesn't just happen. It has to be fought for. And the fight isn't over. Want to hear more stories about real people standing up against injustice? Then make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that could change the way you see the world. And let's keep this conversation going. Drop a comment below. What do you think of Elena's fight for justice? Have you ever seen or experienced something like this in real life? Your voice matters, and together, we can bring even more attention to the fights that need to be won. Because at the end of the day, justice isn't just a concept, it's something we have to demand. And as long as there are people like Elena willing to stand up, there's always hope for a better, fairer world.